From downtown Oakland, California, this is Chuck.
And this is Karen.
And this is our show,
What If It Really Works?
A Practical Guide to Spirituality. And Karen, who is this man we're looking at?
We are so delighted today. We are excited. This is a dear friend who Chuck has known for a number of years. And this is Michael Rothschild. He's a professor. He is the former dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs at Princeton. He is a visiting professor at the Department of Economics at UCLA. And he is a very vital part of a lot of what is going on in this world right now. He co-authored one of the most important papers in economics, Equilibrium in Competitive Insurance Markets, an essay on the economics of imperfect information with J.E. Stiglitz, who was awarded a Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001 for their analysis of markets with asymmetric information. This is really exciting for us to be able to talk to you now, Michael, with everything that is going on in the world today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I probably should say that Joe Stiglitz got the Nobel Prize for a lot of things, including the paper we wrote together.
Okay. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
So, Michael, you've lived a life in economics. How did you get started? What attracted you to economics? Most people would say, well, that is the dismal science. So what happened?
Well, oddly enough, what appealed to me about economics was that it seemed somehow real. And I need to explain what I mean by that. When I went to college, I wanted to find something I could do which in my current, rather naive ideas, or then current ideas, involved helping people. And at first this focused on psychoanalysis and Freud, and then I got more and more interested in people all the way around the world. And I got interested in what were called quaintly in the early 60s, new nations. That is, places like Indonesia, which just had achieved freedom, colonialism, and I wondered how that they would become democratic one way or another. And I went to graduate school essentially to study this, and I was part of a program in what was basically political science. And the longer I stayed in this, the more it all seemed very abstract and very theoretical. And I just didn't have the faintest idea what it is that I would actually do in order to somehow do what I wanted to do. And I was part of an interdisciplinary program which had economics as a part. And I was lucky enough to take a course from James Tobin, one of the really great economists of our time, who got the Nobel Prize, I think in the late 70s, but was also a wonderful, warm man, an extremely clear teacher. And when he taught economics, I could understand how the arm bone connected to the shank bone, what the steps of the reasoning were. And I sort of felt when I was doing it in political science, it was something like, and then a miracle happened, or I really didn't understand how the theories, what the theories meant and how they were applied. Now, the economic theories made sense to me largely because they were mathematical. And I have a mathematical mind, and I could really follow the mathematical reasoning. Now, it seemed to me that these theories made sense because although you can get the notion that economists don't disagree about don't agree about anything, and they're all fighting Keynesian, monetarist, right wing, left wing. That's a very distorted picture of economics. The amount about which almost all good economists agree is very, very large. We tend to agree that incentives matter to people, that if you offer them two things which are the same, one at a higher price and one at a lower price, that in general people will buy the lower price thing. Not always, not immediately, but in general that's what will happen, and it's a good generalization. We tend to think that the right way to think about whether or not policies make sense is whether or not they're efficient, which economists mean in a very simple way is that if you take all the resources that are used to produce something, you could find some other way to put it together which produced that amount and more. And economists tend to believe under fairly general, under specific conditions, that people left to their own devices and markets left to their own devices will find efficient solutions. There's a lot of disagreement about how exactly that insight should be used in policy, how much markets should be left free. And so, but those are things which people can disagree about, and they can disagree in a way that it makes progress possible. They disagree about what numbers are, what tendencies are, and so on. And there's a very high degree of agreement. And I just loved economics because it had a core theory that made a great deal of sense to me, and it seemed to me to hold more in tools for understanding how society works and how people work, and also for improving it than anything else. And maybe the really important thing is that Jim Tobin was just a great teacher, but those were the two things that really made me like economics. In some sense, macroeconomics is a lot harder. You don't get many observations. It requires a great deal of abstraction, and you're always saying things that aren't quite true, whereas microeconomics is essentially straightforward in that you make assumptions about how markets work, how people behave, embody them in some kind of abstract system, generally with mathematics being a part of it, and you work out the implications. And I've always found it much more easy than macroeconomics, just because sort of you have to do less guesses about what are absolutely the right assumptions to make, which aren't quite true, which in some ways encapsulate how the economy works. And there's a sense in which I think microeconomists are much less imaginative than macroeconomists, but they also are more likely to get things right.
Accuracy helps, huh?
Yeah.
So where would you place yourself on that scale? Do you do both macro and micro?
I make snide jokes about macro and I do micro.
Okay, good. So you're in that group of people that are more likely to get the answer right.
I think so.
So what is the dynamic? Where do people interact with the money systems? Can we by changing our consciousness, can we, for example, avert an economic disaster?
I'm probably not the right person to answer that question or to ask that question. I don't think so. I tend to focus on people being motivated by pretty mean things, like trying to get the best deal for themselves, buying the lowest prices, and so on. I think that the way to get people to drive less is to raise the price of gasoline rather than to raise consciousness. And it's just my own belief set, and it's the way in which I think most economists think about these questions. But anyway, it's certainly the way I do.
So one of the things that got you prominence, in addition to being the dean at the Woodrow Wilson School, was this business of working with probabilities in the marketing of of insurance. Is that correct?
Let me give a kind of indirect answer. One of the things to understand is that from the point of view of graduate students, people learning how to do research, the world really is dominated by the trend of the moment. And people work on a particular set of problems because they seem to be the ones that are interesting, that people are making progress on. And I was very, very lucky to start looking at uncertainty and how people behaved when they really didn't know exactly what was happening, just as the profession was discovering this as an important area of research. And it was enormously exciting. And things had to be thought through more or less from the beginning. And it was just exciting to be part of that. And there are lots of questions lying around sort of for the asking when you stumble upon a subject matter which just a whole lot of people are working on it together, and they don't quite know how things are going to work out. And I was really enormously lucky just to be part of that. And one of the major questions that was there was the question of how markets work when the market participants, the buyer and the seller, have different information about things. And insurance was just a wonderful example of that. Mm-hmm. And if you consider kind of the absolute simplest model of an insurance market, and I just should stop and say that the right way to do the kinds of things that I have been doing is to think about the absolute simplest model of something, because it may be kind of wrong and it may not get all of the complexity, but if you do a very simple model, it will allow you to get at the issue that you think is most important. So the most important issue, or the simplest model, was an insurance market. And the way to think about this is that the people who buy insurance have a probability of becoming sick. And if they become sick, the cost of curing them will be a certain amount. And the only issue that differentiates people is what the probability is of being sick. And there are, I'll call them sick people, who have a very high probability of getting sick, and healthy people who have a low probability of getting sick. And if I sell you an insurance policy, I make a promise that I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money if you get sick. Now, if I'm an insurance company, I really want to sell these policies to healthy people, not to sick people. Sort of as banks want to lend money to people who don't really need money, insurance companies want to sell health insurance to people who don't need it very much. And so insurance companies try to find out as much as possible about the people that they're selling insurance with. And that's called underwriting, and that's why car insurance is often predicated upon your past driving record and your age and a whole bunch of other things that you can know about. But being sick, at least in our simple model, wasn't a simple matter of something you can know. It's not as if people went around being labeled, I'm a sick person or I'm a healthy person. The insurance company didn't know. And a good way an insurance company could try to find out is that it could offer people health insurance where you didn't pay that much for health insurance, but there wasn't very much but your probability of getting sick was low, and so a policy which didn't cost that much and particularly didn't deliver that much, I'm sorry, I said this wrong, a policy that was less generous, if it had a low price, would be quite attractive to a healthy person, but a sick person would stay away from it completely. And so we thought that the way in which insurance markets would work is that insurance companies would end up offering pairs of policies, some which were cheap and some which were expensive, where cheap and expensive means how much they paid in the case of an illness, and that, again, healthy people would buy the cheap policies and the sick people would buy the more expensive policies, and in that way the market would be segmented. And we worked this out and looked at how competitive markets would work with insurance operating this way. And what we found was that this was one of those examples where markets which are left free just don't do very well. And they worked very strangely, and we wrote a lot about how they might work and what might happen. But the really important thing, it turned out, for what we did was that what people have called adverse selection worked, which is that you could offer policies which would lead sick and healthy people to buy different policies, and that that would segregate the insurance market essentially into people who bought expensive policies and people who bought cheap policies. And you could think about this in terms of the discussion of the individual mandate. It's almost a matter of age, where young, healthy people would buy policies or no policies, which were different from the policies that older, sick people would buy. And once you say that it's not legal to condition a policy on age, you have an insurance company being prohibited from competing using underwriting in the way in which they do. But the really important thing, as I said, was this phenomena of people reacting differently depending on whether or not they were sick or healthy to different priced insurance companies. And I need to say that we wrote this paper in the early 70s, and neither Joe Stiglitz nor I knew a thing about insurance. This was a product of pure reason. We said, suppose the world was this way. Here's how it would work. And I have to do another segue, which is I got my Ph.D. in 1969. And the biggest change in economics since then is that there's an enormous amount of data that people can use to look at hypotheses like that. I think it's fair to say that not only did Joe or I not have the slightest idea how insurance markets actually worked, we didn't think that anybody would ever get any data that would discuss how it worked, and that this was a very interesting, pure theory. It turned out that since 1969, an enormous amount of data has become available. People have got better statistical techniques for analyzing it. And now we know what we didn't know in 1969, and we've been knowing more for the past 20, 30 years, that adverse selection really is important. It's there, and it's there in health insurance markets. And probably the simplest example to think about adverse selection, and I don't know how many this will make sense with, but in the universities which I've worked, it's always been the case that there's a choice of policies for everybody who works there, and that there's one policy which just covers everything, and there are other policies which cover less and less, and they're cheaper. If you have a policy which is an HMO and has pretty severe limits about what it covers, it costs a lot much less than a policy that lets you see your own doctor and pays for absolutely everything. And the experience of universities which offered, say, two contracts, a cheap policy and expensive policy, is that every year they offered it, the expensive policy wouldn't quite break even. And the expensive policy could only break even if it were the case that a fair number of healthy people bought it as well as just sick people. And it would turn out that not enough people bought it, so they'd raise the price of this and less people would buy it. And they'd raise the price and less people would buy it. And pretty soon, at a price that made sense, you'd only have one person who knew he was going to have a heart transplant tomorrow and would cost $1 million wanting that policy. And that policy disappeared. And that's been called a death spiral. And death spirals of insurance policies have been observed a fair number of times. It's not just a figment of our imagination. So we looked at this and we thought it was fun, and subsequently other people discovered it was real and it was important.
It was important enough to win a Nobel for, huh?
Well, it was part of a general, I talked about how this was a really exciting period, and there were lots and lots of things being discovered about asymmetric information and how markets worked where there was asymmetric information. And our piece was a pretty important part.
Mm-hmm. So yesterday, the Supreme Court approved the medical care plan that has been up in the air and worked on for the last couple of years. Well, what does this mean in terms of our economic situation, if that's where you'd like to look at it?
Well, there's a lot of, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's sometimes known, is huge. Thousands and thousands of pages and zillions of things, and it does lots and lots of things. To my mind, because I'm pretty much a bleeding heart liberal, the most important thing the Affordable Care Act does is that it provides health insurance for people who previously couldn't afford it. Either gives it to them for nothing or gives it to them at a great subsidy. And that's an enormous change in income distribution and how the least fortunate in our society are cared for, etc. That, to my mind, is the big part of this act. Now, what the Supreme Court specifically was dealing with was what's called the individual mandate. And the individual mandate really deals a lot with adverse selection. And what the individual mandate says is, well, if you think about insurance, in a sense, everybody in society pays for insurance. That if you provide health care to everybody, and I sometimes don't like thinking about insurance, but I like thinking about health care, which is what it really is.
Exactly.
And if you're going to provide health care to everybody, and you're going to run it through the tax system in one way or another, everybody is buying it. and paying for it. And if you're going to expand coverage to a lot of people, that's expensive and you have to pay for it. And one way to pay for it is to require everybody to buy insurance, that is, to pay a certain amount of money for the right to receive a certain amount of health care. And for some people, when I was talking about healthy people before, that's not a very good deal. If I'm young and healthy, the amount that I'd be asked to pay for insurance is probably a lot more than it's worth to me, particularly if something really serious would happen. I'd be covered by an emergency room or something. But anyway, young, healthy people wouldn't buy insurance. And in order to make this work for everybody, we essentially require everybody, regardless of their age or their health status, to pay into the healthcare system. And that's what the individual mandate is. And Obamacare expansion of insurance won't work without finding revenues to pay for it. And one of the ways to pay for it is essentially to require everybody to pay in, just as we require young people to pay in to a Social Security system, which will provide them with a pension when they're older, even though it's not really clear whether or not buying Social Security is a good deal for young people. We still make them do it, and that's the way in which the insurance system runs. And the Supreme Court upheld the individual mandate, and that was really the biggest part of the Insurance Act from my point of view. And in terms of things I've worked on, it was predicated on an analysis of how insurance systems would work, which is that adverse selection really matters. And if you want to think about something that doesn't work, part of the problem with the insurance system, one of the parts of the changes is the notion that people have to sell you insurance regardless of pre-existing conditions. And that means, to caricature it, that instead of having ambulance chasers who would be signing you up as lawyers, you'd have ambulance chasers who would be selling you insurance just as you were about to go in for an expensive operation. But because pre-existing conditions, i.e. the stroke you just had or whatever, aren't covered, you'd have to buy it at the same price as everybody else. And people who put off buying insurance until they really needed it would be an enormous burden on everybody else.
So it does solve the adverse selection problem, and it distributes the exposure over the entire population that's going to be covered. What happens long term to this? What are the implications long term? Let's go out 5 years. What happens by 2017?
One of the things I first have to say, I said something about how microeconomists really can make predictions and so on. Microeconomists have been writing things about the health system for at least 50, 60 years that are very wise and full of predictions, and none of it's been right. So I wouldn't buy much about the prediction that anybody made about how the health insurance was going to change, with one exception. And the one exception is that we know that costs of health care are going up at a very high rate, and they will continue to unless somebody stops it. And they're going up at a high rate, first of all, because there's an enormous amount that we can do that we didn't used to be able to do. think of how much more expensive healthcare is because we can do dialysis and kidney repair. Well, if we didn't have that, healthcare would be a lot cheaper. And we've had a continual expansion of the things that we can do, and we keep on providing more and more for people, and we keep on raising the barrier at which we think it's reasonable, so that my mother, who was 96, underwent an operation where essentially an aortic valve was replaced. That was an operation which used to involve a quadruple bypass, and no one would ever think about doing it for somebody over 80, let alone somebody over 90. But the new technology lets you do it in a way which is somewhat like laparoscopic surgery, where there's no incisions and so on. And although it isn't a walk in the park, it's something you can do. It's very expensive. And companies that do this are just waiting for Medicare to approve this operation, which it did in the case of my mother, and the costs are going to go up. Something's got to stop that cost. And I think, and here, remember the economist's record about predictions, that nothing's going to cost that isn't called rationing in one way or another. That we either say that we won't do this unless you pay for it, or we let the market ration, which is a nice way for saying that only rich people can buy the things that we can do, or something like that. The Affordable Care Act has a lot of provisions in it which they hope will drive costs down, because some of the ways in which medical care, healthcare is organized in the U.S. is simply stupid. And there's easy ways to say what should be changed. It's not necessarily easy ways to change things that would actually work. But one prediction which is clear, which is that the percentage that the U.S. spends on healthcare, which has been rising steadily, is not going to go above 100% of GDP. We can't spend more than that. On its current trend, it's headed there.
Wow.
I mean, I think it's now close to 20%. I may have the figure wrong. I'm not very good with numbers, but it's just been climbing inexorably, and something has to stop it. And I think everybody recognizes that. The Affordable Care Act has trial balloons for lots and lots of ideas that different people have had about what might change it.
And at the same time, if I remember my figures correctly, we rank like 29th in overall population health, don't we, in the world? Somewhere like that?
Yeah, I think the key thing to say about U.S. healthcare is the inequality of the way in which its benefits are distributed. To somebody like me, who is relatively rich, but more importantly has lots of good contacts in the medical world, can find out what can get done and so on. This is the best healthcare in the world. There's no doubt about it. But we're pretty high on infant mortality. We don't provide good prenatal care. We don't provide good preventive care. And if you look at average health measures of things like infant death or life expectancy at birth and so on, the U.S. is not number one. It's just number one in spending.
Uh-huh. And that's a big deal, isn't it?
It's a big deal to me.
Yeah. Seems like it would be a big deal to anybody, because we ought to be able. Is preventative medicine part of the key to solving the problem?
I actually think that's, with some exception, overrated. But I'm not really an expert. I do know that there's an enormous return to providing mothers with advice about how to raise children, and well-child visits and prenatal visits and so on, that really does produce better babies. You can actually look in the US and you can find that we essentially expanded a program called WIC, W-I-C, which I forget what it stands for, although it's infants and children. And after WIC came in, you could look at the quality of babies. And by this I mean, when every baby is born, they take measures called the AGPAIR score, the weight, and other things, and you just can get an index of quality of babies. And the quality of babies went up after WIC went in, significantly. So that's good. I'm a little less certain about things like physical exams, some of the things that have been called preventative care, like prostate examinations and common breast x-ray, regular mammograms, seem to hurt more than help. And I think it's less a matter of preventive care than what I would call smart care, which is doing the things that are most valuable and not doing too much defensive medicine, too much tests, etc.
So you become fairly well versed in this whole insurance picture, and just listening to you explain these problems and the solutions that you found, it's really interesting and fun to hear you talk about that. And I want to go just a little bit beyond that at this point.
Yeah.
One of the place where I got to know you was at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton, and that deals with global problems, doesn't it? Doesn't the Woodrow Wilson School prepare people to look at global social and economic problems?
Yeah, let me tell you a factoid that I learned yesterday, which was just wonderful. Do you know how the Harvard Business School started?
No.
Well, the Harvard Business School started because we started having more and more diplomats and more the State Department running, and we needed, instead of just casual people who were hired sometimes on contract because they happened to be in the country, we needed professional diplomats to go staff embassies and represent the US. The Harvard Business School started as a place that was going to prepare these kinds of diplomats. And since that time, there's been a considerable need for public servants who were trained to do the things that they do better, just like businessmen who learn, or businessmen and women who learn what MBAs learn, are better prepared. And the Woodrow Wilson School is a school which prepares people to go off and do public service. Now, what public service is enormously changed. The Woodrow Wilson School, in some ways, at its inception, wasn't much different from Harvard Business School at its inception. The basic notion was that we would provide people to work as diplomats for the State Department, etc. But as the world changed, people who do good in the world do it in many different roles. And in fact, when I was dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, the State Department gave the Foreign Service exam, which was the only way in which you could get in to the diplomatic corps, only every 2 or 3 years, and had a very sharp limit on the number of people would take, so that if the Woodrow Wilson School had only admitted people who could work for the State Department, we would have had a class of 12 or something like that. So instead, we prepare people to work for nonprofits, we prepare people to work for all kinds of bureaucracies. And yes, it does involve the world, and it involves an awful lot of things here. And there are lots and lots of ways in which you can imagine trying to do good in the world, and public policy schools in general try to find a way of teaching, what kinds of skills you can possibly get to do that kind of job better.
It seems like in the last 30 years or so, these public careers or public service careers have lost some prestige. Is that true? And are they still attracting the bright minds that they did 30 and 40 years ago? I mean, we know you're there.
Well, I'm no longer there. That's a good question, and I really don't quite know the answer. Public service goes up and down in popularity. It certainly doesn't help that, sort of this notion that Reagan brought to our country's politics, which is government isn't the solution, government is the problem, is believed by many, and it doesn't encourage public policy careers. But, after 9/11, many, many people wanted to go into public policy careers, and I think that things changed for a while. I suspect that the quality of the Woodrow Wilson School students is, if any, it just keeps on getting better, but that's because it's a very elite and very top school, and I don't know in general. The recession, it's a little bit hard to think about what the recession actually did. Usually it's the case that government jobs are safer than others, and people tend to go to them in depression, although this time the real suffering has also been done by people who work for state and local governments.
Yeah, and that's real obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's this attitude, so what? People have said, well, if the government's the problem, they get rid of the government people, and that's a good thing. And we have police officers and fire officers and teachers and nurses and other people who are really public workers, and they no longer have jobs. Doesn't make sense.
Well, I'm sorry, my reaction to anything is always, it's complicated. One of the most interesting couple of facts that we observed just in the last couple of years was that in Wisconsin, where the governor passed a really strong anti-union bill and exempted police and fire, but kept teachers and other things, he was vastly popular. And many people felt, I think with some correctness, that public servants had negotiated unreasonable contracts, that their pensions were too rich, et cetera, et cetera. And he was very popular. In Ohio, where a right to work law, where a kind of keep the unions, take away rights of public sector unions to bargain, which did not exempt police and fire, was enacted, it went down by a fair margin. And people tend to think police and fire are swell. Teacher unions, even though people like teachers in the abstract, many people don't like teachers unions, and with a lot of good reasons. And so, anyway, it's sort of hard. It's hard for me to understand what the real nature of this backlash is, whether part of it is just plain hard times and a feeling that people who have worked for the government are doing unfairly well and are not sacrificing when many other people are sacrificing. And part of it is this kind of general Reagan legacy.
Mm-hmm. So, when we talk about legacies,
yeah,
and they're all around us, and that is certainly one of them, but you have a legacy. And if somebody was watching this today and they were thinking, boy, this is a really bright guy and he's had a chance to get involved in a lot of things and he's been all the way at the top of the mountain in the economic world, and they were thinking about becoming an economist, what would you tell them?
It's really hard to make a good guess about what the most exciting things are to do. I will say, frankly, that an awful lot of what people do involving verifying theories, in psychology doing lab tests, in economics doing statistics, are enormously difficult and require an awful lot of hard work and not particularly interesting hard work, to gain things. And I mentioned how lucky I was to be in economics at the time where things that you just thought about were opening up and happening. And I'd say find something like that, but I don't know exactly what it is. And I think economics is very exciting because we know more and more, and our empirical tools are better and better, and we can have much more sophisticated notions of how the economy works and so on. And I also think that the fundamental issues about how the brain works and what language is and how we do it is terribly exciting and seems to be changing fast, but it's not clear to me whether or not that work is going to be fun in the sense that the work that I did when I started being an economist was. I don't, I would say, it's a little bit like saying find gold.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you found the gold, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I was wonderfully lucky.
Yes, you certainly were.
But you know what they say about luck is you have to be prepared whenever the time comes that you get the opportunity to take advantage.
I think that my character is sterling. My mother is wonderful and raised me with all the right habits and so on. But fundamentally, I was lucky. There's a lot of people with sterling characters, good mothers, strong work ethics, that just don't get to come across things at a time when it's just wonderful to be there.
Yeah. So in the world of probabilities,
Yeah.
you hit the probability target.
Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah.
I think it's,
Yeah.
okay.
So we're coming to the end of our time together.
Yeah.
But if you were to tell one person or one viewer today something that they could do to improve their own and the national and maybe even the global economy, and I know that's a terrible question, but what can each person do to improve this situation?
I mean, each person or somebody who's going to study it?
Well, we're all involved in the economy. Okay. Whether we're paying our credit card bills or whether we're the Secretary of the Treasury or Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, we're all involved in it. And so we all have some kind of a part. How can a person who's not at the Woodrow Wilson School or the Treasury or the Nobel, what can they do to improve the economy? I know that's a tough question.
My own guess is probably it's learn how to think critically and to demand that people tell you things that make sense.
That's great. That's great.
Wonderful.
And we don't do that so well, do we?
No?
Yeah. We allow ourselves to kind of live by myths, don't we?
I think so.
Yeah. So how do you demand people to demand that people tell you things that make sense? How do you do that? Have you got an idea?
Well, I think it's basically through the ballot box and through if it's through the ballot box, it's making people understand why you made the decisions you made.
Yeah.
But Paul Krugman, when he first started writing his column in 2000, wrote about how appalled he was that Bush just lied all the time about the economy and how it was going to work. And I don't know exactly how you stop it. I think more people should point out when people are lying and when things are simply not truth. As a citizen of the world, I don't think that there's much else that you can do is to train yourself to think consistently and understand that when people are not thinking consistently, and it's not as if that's easy, but I can't think of anything else.
That's a big order all by itself, Michael. That's a big deal order. And my own reaction to that is that we have this, there's no other way to call it, but a propaganda machine that's programming people to believe whatever somebody wants them to believe. And the ability to be an independent thinker and to force the truth out is something that's really needed now everywhere.
You know, it's not as if this is the only period in the Earth's history when leaders have lied and there's been propaganda. Hitler, Stalin built their world on it. It's a little bit unclear exactly what's happening in the Arab world, but a lot of it is the crumbling of lies. I never thought that the Soviet Union would disappear. I didn't see any peaceful way in which it would fall apart.
But it did.
It did. South Africa fell. The overall world standard of living of the poorest people has increased enormously in the past 50 years. Most of that's India and China, but that's most of the people, and that's a lot. People tell me Africa is doing better in terms of very crude economic measures. I'm kind of an optimist about trends working out, although I'm not sure that this election is going to turn out the way in which I want it. And things do, in many ways, get better. And if you look at it, you can see long-term trends that are quite exciting. You can also see long-term trends that are pretty terrifying, mostly about the environment.
I think one of the critical things that you said, Michael, for me, and perhaps for others who are listening to this, is when you think of yourself as a citizen of the world, rather than just a citizen of the United States, because the viewers who watch us are all over the world, and all of us are a piece of the world, and every one of us has an important role in making things better. And if we can take the importance of what we are individually and do our best to make everything around us better, then we're in a place where the whole world gets better as a result of that.
I think you're right. It goes against my character to say that that's true. My wife dragged me kicking and screaming to a film about people who navigated the LA River that's just coming out. And this was a glorious example of just a few people doing something that had an enormous effect. And these things do happen.
Exactly. We want to just pause for 1 second.
Yeah.
And Michael, one final question, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. What is happening with the environment, and how is that going to be solved by or affect our economic situation, or both?
You know, there's a certain sense in which what's happening to the environment is very simple. I'm not a very good chemist or physicist, but there's a very simple equation which says essentially that if you spew a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, the Earth gets hotter. And there's no way of escaping from the logic of this equation any more than there is hoping that if you jump off the Empire State Building, you'll go up. The issues are how long it will take, how much the situations that we've set in place now are set in place, and there's no way that we can change it. I mean, you know, the environment is in some ways changing, in some ways like docking a huge ocean liner with lots and lots of momentum in a harbor. You don't change directions quickly. And so it's absolutely clear that just as we can't spend more than 100% of GDP on health care, that if we don't change the amount of carbon we're spewing into the atmosphere, terrible things are going to happen in terms of temperature rising, sea levels rising, etc. I don't think people have very good estimates about when or how imminent disaster is, or whether or not the last couple of summers is really good evidence that we're already in trouble. But I do know that current trends are just unsupportable. And I personally believe, as an economist, as I said at the beginning, people react to incentives. I don't think we're going to get people to stop polluting by asking them to recycle, by telling them that it's virtuous not to use water, that we're going to do this by prices, and we're going to do this by charging money, essentially, to put carbon in the atmosphere, taxing gas, whatever, and that's the only way in which things will work, and whether or not these will work fast enough to make it be that we're not jumping off the Empire State Building, we haven't fallen, or just walking towards the edge. I don't know. I think the prudent course is to think that we are, and to try and change things now as quickly as possible. I am very discouraged by the politics.
Yeah, because we're just not dealing with it.
Yeah.
Just maybe if we don't pay attention to it, it'll go away.
Whatever it is, it's pretty clear that Obama's not going to be reelected by running on a platform of a huge gas tax.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of the solution.
I think that that's inevitably part of a solution, that without these higher prices, nothing is going to change. Mm-hmm. Now, that's my church, and not everybody belongs to it.
Michael, we've come to the end of our time with you, but thank you so much. This has been so kind of you to take the time, and our viewers are going to learn something today that they probably never even thought about. And the fact that you told it to us is very, very special. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you for letting me be part of this very special thing you're doing. Thank you.
Thank
you. It's been wonderful having you with us today, Michael. We appreciate it.
Say the magic words, Karen.
God bless you, Michael Rothschild. God bless you and the work you do in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.